All right, we are live, everyone. Good evening. Happy Shabbat Shalom. Happy Sabbath. Um, Anyone who knows something about the Sabbath practices, typically Sabbath starts on Friday evening. So Shabbat Shalom. I hope that your week was well. I hope that you all are settling into your weekend or um, time to spend with God, really time to rest. So we are on our part 5 of our series of what is Passover. We have been studying this week on the aspects of Passover that we need to understand better, and like what is it? Where did it come from? Like why do we do it? Why don't we do it? Um, should we do it? Like we've been talking about all of those topics. If you have not been able to join us, if I could recommend that you watch any of the series, it would be part 1, which I did on Monday nights, and that was really going through the original um, this learning about Passover when God was actually passing over the Israelites and what happened when they were about to come out of Egypt and how he delivered them from the hand of Pharaoh by allowing them to their children not to be killed, but the firstborn male of the Egyptians to be killed, and the whole story of Passover and how that happened. And so it's a phenomenal story. So please go back to Exodus 12 and read it on your own, or go back and listen to that video, because I actually walked through verse by verse. We talked about that thing verse by verse in Exodus 12. So I would really highly encourage you. My YouTube page, for those who are just joining me maybe for the first time, is Getting on Higher Ground 2997. And you can visit there so that you can learn more about it. But I am happy to jump in tonight. I'm a little late starting the live because I'm somewhere else. So I wanted to definitely bring you all another word. And this time, I think I'm picking up on a pattern of something that I'm noticing with the children of Israel and how they are restoring themselves back to God. One thing that I know that we talk about a lot, or pastors maybe, or in Bible studies, maybe they do this sort of thing where they talk about how the children of Israel were idolatrous and they didn't listen, they disobeyed God, they always sort of like turned away and then want to run back and repent. But one of the patterns that I am also picking up on is the way in which they got themselves back in order with God. And we really need to pay attention to that pattern, because that's something that we as his people in this generation, this day and age, need to also do, is get ourselves back in order with God. And there is a certain pattern that they show us in several different scriptures. Not only did we read Exodus 12 and we continue to refer to Exodus 12, we have also read through 2 Chronicles 29 and 30, and then I believe last night we were in Second Chronicles 34 and 35. Those were two different stories, and one about King Hezekiah and how he restored the people back. Another one about King Josiah, who many years later restored the people back. This time we're actually going to dive into the book of Ezra for a moment. I was going to go ahead and talk about Jesus in the Passover, but I think I'm going to wait because it's some more things that I'm, discovering. Remember, I told y'all that as I'm learning, I'm passing on the information to you. We're kind of like learning together, we're reading together. And I think that this year is just a critical time for us to decide that we're going to let go of traditions and we're going to embrace. And so this is my first year celebrating Passover. I'm very excited about it. And I wanted to make sure I learned and prep myself before Passover comes. We can't wait until the season of the appointed time is here to learn about it. It's great to learn about it before, so you can prepare your heart and your mind for that moment. And so, again, Shabbat Shalom, and let's jump into it. If you would like to see the screen that I'm about to share, I would encourage you to use the link in my bio to join my YouTube, Getting on Higher Ground 2997, and that way you can read along. If not, please um, go to the Bible, and we're going to be in the Old Testament again, and we are reading from Ezra 6. I am going to read from New Living Translation. We're not going to argue about which translation is better. This is for ease of understanding for the majority of people. And if you want to go back and read it in KJV to cross reference some things, you surely can. I don't harp on which version. It's what's best for you, and then I love to cross-reference different versions to make sure I get the best understanding that I can of the original intent of the verses, and then the Hebraic translations of things of the words. So let's dive into Ezra 6, y'all. I am excited to read and study with you all. One thing that I want to say about this book in particular, this is after the captivity in Babylon. So when the Egyptians, I'm back in Exodus, y'all, sorry, when the Israelites were basically thrown out of Israel, they were so bad as far as their idolatry was concerned. And if you want to read about how bad it was, you need to read some of Ezekiel. They were so bad about how idolatry, as far as idolatry was concerned, that God kicked them out. He had already given them a warning that, like, you won't be able to remain in my land if you don't do what I'm telling you to do. If you don't follow I have created you. I have set you apart, called you to leave your original land. I done put your ancestor in a place. I promised the land to him. I put the people in order. I gave you all the rules and regulations to follow. If you can't do it my way, you can't be in my land. And this is critical for us to understand. We don't own nothing, not a darn thing do we own or control. So when it comes to God's land, he has authority over who is in it, who's not in it, who can stay in it, based on how we treat him and treat the land. And they had defiled God by worshiping idols, and they had defiled that land by having altars and pagan worship all over it. So God had kicked them out. And for 70 years, Jeremiah already had told them earlier in the Bible, for 70 years, you're going to be in captivity. And then God's going to deliver you and allow you to come back. So it took 70 years. So when Ezra comes onto the scene, this book starts by talking about them returning from captivity. And one of the main things that they do when they return from captivity, every single time they are held captive, and they're getting themselves back right with God, one of the main things that they do is they cleanse the land, they build the church or rebuild the church or restore the temple to its former glory, because the temple really represented people to be in structured alignment on how they worship God and what kind of practices they had. If they did church right, essentially, then they would live their lives right. But when we allow church to be out of order, that like literally the house, the temple of God to be out of order, not the ecclesia of the body as in us. But when we allow the temple of God to be out of order, we kind of act crazy. And you can kind of see that in your own church. When people are allowed to just run amok in church and not do things in divine order, it usually ends up in chaos. It usually ends up with some stuff happening. So it's the same thing that happened in the Bible. They got it together, the temple wise, and then they started to embrace a lot of the practices and feasts that God had aligned. And so this is what we're going to talk about again tonight, because that's exactly what ends up happening in Ezra. And I want to just start with verse 1 so that you all just have some context as far as what's happening and the intent behind it. And of course, we're going to touch on Passover towards the end of the chapter, but it all kind of goes together. So remember, they had come back into the land from captivity, like 70 years they've been gone. Remnants that's left are returning back to Judah, Jerusalem, and then some of the other regions beyond that. And they are beginning to occupy the land. One of the main things that they want to do is rebuild the temple because it got burned down. This is the temple that Solomon built. It got burnt down, so they need to rebuild the whole thing. So it says in verse 1, so King Darius issued orders that a search be made in the Babylonian archives, which were stored in the treasury. But it was at the fortress of Ecbatana in the province of Media that a scroll was found. This is what it said. So essentially, what was going on, now mind you, I don't know this book thoroughly in and out, but from what I gathered, what was going on was there was resistance to building the temple and them supporting it, meaning them as in the people who held them captive, supporting Israel with going back to their homeland. There was some resistance. And so in order to allow it to happen, this king, who was a king of Babylon, went to the records to search the records. He didn't just want to make a decision off a decision, because even though they were in captivity, they very much so understood the power of God's people, and nobody was really trying to go against what God wanted to do. He allowed it for a time, but God wasn't just sending them to Babylon to be a slave forever. So in verse 3, we see that this is what the memorandum read. In the first year of King Cyrus's reign, a decree was sent out concerning the temple of God at Jerusalem. Let the temple be rebuilt on the site where Jews used to offer their sacrifices, using the original foundations. Its height will be 90 feet and its width will be 90 feet. Every 3 layers of specially prepared stones will be topped by a layer of timber. All expenses will be paid by the royal treasury. Furthermore, the gold and silver cups which were taken to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar from the temple of God in Jerusalem must be returned to Jerusalem and put back where they belong. Let them be taken back to the temple of God. So, this is the decree that a previous king had wrote so that it would happen when it was supposed to happen. Like, he already put it in historical record, like, hey, this is what needs to take place. So all Darius needed to do was read it and implement the plan that was already set forth. And literally everything that was set forth was for them to rebuild the temple. They gave us certain dimensions of the temple, what it was to be built with, and how it was to be funded. So when we let God work it out through people, it don't matter who is being worked out through, whether that person is necessarily secular, they a Gentile, or they're a believer, it don't matter. Let God work it out, because he can use anybody. And it might not just be somebody in your church that he uses to bless you. It says that the wealth of the righteous is stored up with the sinner, or the something to that effect. I can't even remember. It's in Deuteronomy. So sometimes God is going to move on the behalf of the sinner to bless you. So let it happen. All right, so let's dive into this. So then it says in verse 6, so the king sent this message. Now, therefore, Tatanai, governor of the province west of the Euphrates, and Shether Bazani, and your colleagues and other officials west of the Euphrates River, stay away from there. Do not disturb the construction of the temple of God. So that he was talking about that resistance that they had to build it, that they were trying to come against, the enemies were trying to come against. He said, no, stop, do not resist. He even knew the power of like what would happen if they tried to resist what was meant to happen based on the decree. If the decree was written plenty of time ago, because it was even written, it was needed to be done. That's how powerful like these decrees are that kings made. Let it be rebuilt on its let it be rebuilt on its original site, and do not hinder the governor of Judah and the elders of the Jews in their work. Moreover, verse 8, I hereby decree that you are to help these elders of the Jews as they rebuild this temple of God. You must pay the full construction costs without delay from my taxes collected in the province west of the Euphrates River, so that the work will not be interrupted. So not only are you not going to resist the work that's being built as far as the temple is concerned, you're also going to fund it, is what this king was telling his governors, which would be like, think of like how we have presidents and then governors of each state. So he would have been the king over the whole kingdom. And then he would have had people who ruled in each sort of state, region, area. All right. So then it says 9, give the priests in Jerusalem whatever is needed in the way of young bulls, rams, and male lambs for the burnt offerings presented to the God of heaven. And without fail, provide them with as much wheat, salt, wine, and olive oil as they need each day. Then they will be able to offer acceptable sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the welfare of the king and his sons. Now, this is good, because what he's saying is not only are you going to fund the whole rebuilding of the temple, you are also going to give them everything that they need in order to live and thrive in and around that temple. So anything that they need as far as a sacrifice is concerned to get that temple back right, anything they need to live off of, you're going to give it to them. So they didn't have to worry about anything. It was going to be provided to them per the king. The same people who had them in captivity that was controlling them is now going to fund what they need to happen in order to get back in right standing with God. Those who violate this decree in any way will have a beam pulled from their house. Then they will be lifted up and impaled on it, and their house will be reduced to a pile of rubble. May the God who has chosen the city of Jerusalem as the place to honor his name destroy any king or nation that violates this command and destroys the temple. I, Darius, have issued this decree. Let it be obeyed with all diligence. Okay. Then we go into 13. It says, Tatanai, governor of the province west of the Euphrates, and Shether-Bozenai and their colleagues complied at once with the command of King Darius. Now, we're talking about people who don't even have faith in God, like as far as soul faith, as far as like we're not going to worship other gods and they're going to follow the ways of the Israelites. Like they weren't Israelites, but they respect God enough to know that he is the God of heaven. He is the supreme one, and we're going to get these people their temple. We're not going to stand in the way of God. So even in your own life, people who are not really believers, they're not going to stand in your way. They can't. When it comes down to spiritual authority, they don't have it. And so they have to back down every time you come and you're approaching with the God of angels of heaven's armies. They got to back down every time. Same way that the Babylonian people and leaders were having to back down. So it says they complied at once. So the Jewish elders in verse 14 continued their work, and they were greatly encouraged by the preaching of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo. The temple was finally finished, as had been commanded by the God of Israel and decreed by Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, the kings of Persia. The temple was completed on March 12th during the 6th year of King Darius's reign. The temple of God, verse 16, was then dedicated with great joy by the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the people who had returned from exile. During the dedication ceremony for the temple of God, 100 young bulls, 200 rams, and 400 male lambs were sacrificed, and 12 male goats were presented as a sin offering for the 12 tribes of Israel. Then the priests and Levites were divided into their various divisions to serve at the temple of God in Jerusalem, as prescribed in the book of Moses. Everything got into order. Again, one of the things that I'm pointing out to you, as has been done when we read the story of Hezekiah, King Josiah, and now in this story with Ezra and King Darius, this is showing us that in order to get things back in order, we got to take care of God's house. We have to prioritize how we contribute to the work being done in the house of the Lord, how we contribute to the church being built, because it is a place of what was referred to in Exodus 12, holy assembly. And that is critical. I would never want, I'm a person who left my church, previous church, I would say. I'm visiting another one, I'm seeing it out. However, the holy assembly is critical to the life of a believer being in like a priority. Like it needs to be something that you do on a regular basis. So we cannot forsake, like Paul told us in the New Testament, the gathering of the people. Like going to church is something important, but we have to make sure that we're building the right thing in the right way. So this is an opportunity for them to make sure that the temple is getting right, because it's going to be a place of holy assembly. That is the place where they went to see God's presence. That is the place that they went to employ God to work on their behalf. So they had to make sure that the place that they was going to go to implore God to work on their behalf was in right standing. It was pure. We have to make sure that the churches that we are going to, the temples that we are worshiping in, are pure, y'all. From a leadership perspective, from like a literal perspective, like God's house deserves his best, because God does not give us sloppy seconds. He gives us his best. His house deserves the best. So when it comes to this is a great example of how to make sure that we are doing things in decency and order in the house, because that's God's best. And that is where we We practice the holy assembly that is critical to any believer's like growth and just lifestyle. Even if your holy assembly is at someone's home, you're not just gonna go to somebody's home and it's not clean and it's not acceptable. Like, you need something that's nice and pure. Like, that's what God requires. Okay, so enough of that. Let's dive into the ending of this chapter, and then we're going to wrap up for tonight. This is where it talks about the celebration of Passover in this book. But I had to show you how they had a lot of intentionality in preparing to be able to even get to the point of Passover. They had to do it in the right order. So it says on April 21st, the returned exiles celebrated Passover. So the footnote on this part, I want to point out, Hebrew on the 14th day of the first month of the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar, and they determined that this date was actually April 21st, which is interesting because this year is going to be April 22nd that we celebrate Passover. So it says on this particular time, on April 21st, the returned exiles celebrated Passover. The priests and Levites had purified themselves and were ceremonially clean. So they slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the returned exiles, for their fellow priests, and for themselves. So this was like a good symbolic moment to understand. In verse 21, it then says, the Passover meal was eaten by the people of Israel who had returned from exile and by the others in the land who had returned from their corrupt practices to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. Then they celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days. There was great joy throughout the land because the Lord had caused the king of Assyria to be favorable to them, so that he helped them to rebuild the temple of God, the God of Israel. So I find it interesting that the timing in which they were able to finish the rebuilding of the temple was the same time that the new year would have been coming in, and they would have been celebrating Passover at the time. In the beginning, when Passover was initially given to them, what happened was it was them coming out of slavery. At the moment that they're coming out of slavery, they're celebrating Passover, and I think it's a lot of correlation with it. In this example, they're coming out of captivity, yet again, slavery, and celebrating Passover. So these are the types of moments that we have the benefit of knowing about, so that when it comes to us doing a Passover celebration, we are truly understanding what it means for God to have passed over us and what it means for him to actually be blessing us through his presence and what he's going to provide as a continual sacrifice for us and our sins. So when we go back to verse 19, and it says that the returned exiles celebrated Passover, that means they didn't say that, oh, everything had to be perfect and we have to be living here for a certain amount of years, or we got to be a believer, a Hebrew, an Israelite practicing this for a certain amount of years. Once they were able to do it, they did it. And so they celebrated Passover. And then it says the priests and Levites had purified themselves and were ceremonially clean. So they did it, but they also did it in the right order. They made sure that the people who were supposed to be going forth to stand in the gap, to be the ones to help atone for their sins, and to be the ones to help celebrate this, they had to be pure and clean. Like there are a lot of Levitical laws as far as the priest is concerned. And in order to serve in the temple, you have to be clean. So they made sure that all of this stuff was ready and prepared so that Passover could be celebrated. So even the people who had the job of working directly with the people and ministering to them, via the burnt offerings and all the things that they did for them, they made sure that they were even prepared. So it's a lot of preparation that goes into making sure that we serve God properly. You can't just sort of wake up and decide to do something. Like, God does know our heart, but also there is a right way and a best way to come before God. So I was glad to see that it even pointed out that they had purified themselves and were clean, ceremonially clean. And they slaughtered the Passover lamb. Now, this is critical because in order for you to be, so like when God gave them initially the command to celebrate Passover, there was a certain amount of cleanliness that needed to happen, a certain amount of preparation that needed to happen, so that the Passover lamb could be purified still, and it could be slaughtered. So that is such y'all really have to see a lot of the symbolism that the Bible talks about, because when it repeats those types of things over and over again about being ceremonially clean, about the lamb being a pure sacrifice and stuff, is such a depiction of how Jesus is for us. You cannot tell me that you cannot see that as far as Passover is concerned, that it needed to be a clean animal. It needed to be something that was pure. And Jesus happened to be the same way, where he was pure and clean. Like, in order to be our perfect sacrifice, you had to, in Passover, you had to choose a lamb or goat with no defects in order for it to actually be an animal that you slaughtered. You couldn't just come to God with anything. The blood of that lamb then was pure, because the animal itself was without defect. So when they put it over the doorpost on the sides of their door, it was pure blood because it was from a pure animal. Jesus' blood is pure because he was pure. That's why it could be a sacrifice. So the lamb with the blood was powerful enough so that it could be something that God would recognize when he was coming through the land of Goshen. He could pass over their homes. The blood of Jesus was pure enough so that God would recognize it and purify our sins, because we would accept that blood as a atonement for our sins. So that's what the exiles also did. They slaughtered the actual Passover lamb. That means one without defects. It was pure, so that even in the sense of them coming through out of exile and rededicating their temple and stuff, they would be again in right standing, and God would pass over any issues, any sins and things like that were happening, because they were willing to do it the way that God did it. When it says that they celebrated the feast of unleavened bread, in that next verse, that is critical, because that's actually talking about the fact that they remove yeast from their, anything like a leavening agent. They remove those things from their home. And so when we have that happening, it's symbolic of us being intentional during this time of year, us being intentional as believers of removing something out of our lives, y'all. It's a practice. It's almost like how people fast and they do certain things where they eat some foods. You're removing the impurities out of your body when you're fasting. So when we're doing something like Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we're removing the impurities of what yeast symbolizes, what the leavening agent symbolizes. That's the sin. You have to be intentional about doing the Holy Assembly, because this is something that it's like the blood washing over you in a very spiritual sense. So when we are intentionally celebrating the feast that God has given us, in particular Passover, it's like it's a washing over us. And so you gotta think of it in a physical sense and in a spiritual sense to understand where how the symbolism is important even to us to this day. No, we don't really know what our ancestors went through when they was coming out of Egypt and passing through the Red Sea into the wilderness and all the things that they experienced. But by celebrating Passover, we have a heart of thankfulness and gratitude for what God has done. So it is critical that we understand that each of the details that it even gives us in these 4 verses in the end of this chapter, that we know that each piece that God gave an instruction. Again, you got to go back to the other video, because Exodus 12, I broke down all the instructions. Each of those instructions is preparing our hearts and minds for the sacrifice that will come. And the more we understand about Passover, the more we allow it to sit in our hearts and minds, the more gratitude I guarantee you will have when you think about what Jesus did, because there was nobody else that could do something like that, like that could foresee something like that and prepare. Like, if you just think about the amount of years that God had prepared his people, if you just think about the amount of years that God had prepared his people to celebrate Passover in order to be able to recognize and celebrate the Passover lamb is in Jesus Christ. Like, he is so intentional in how he has us to do things to prepare the way. Like, that was part of preparing the way, just like John the Baptist was preparing the way for Jesus. That was part of preparing the way. And we need to be doing Passover because we need to be preparing the way for Jesus' second coming. Like we do know that he came once, but he coming back again. So we need to be in the mindset of understanding what to expect and what to do, how to be prepared. How do we stay with our lamps burning bright and not let them go out in the middle of the night because we're waiting? We gotta wait with expectancy. So we gotta be intentional. God is intentional about giving us his feast because it is preparing our hearts and minds for what is to also come. Like it keeps us focused on what's to come. So when we don't do it, then guess what? We are distracted. So what has happened these days? We're not doing the feast, none of the feast. We're not doing Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Festival of Shelters, Feast of Tabernacles, or whichever one you want to call it. We're not doing, it's like 4 of them. We're not doing any of them. We're not giving the offerings. How are we supposed to be preparing our hearts and minds and being intentional about the coming again of Jesus Christ and pushing forth what the kingdom is trying to do if we're not practicing the times that God has given us to practice and we don't have any understanding? Because we are allowing the distractions. If nothing else, we should stop the distractions in order to be able to focus and understand what God really wants us to do. Because to be honest, you can't do both. You can't be distracted and like be focused on what God is doing. Like it will be impossible. So all of this stuff, and I've said this almost every night, all of the things is called these holidays, it's not real holy days. We got to be willing to let go of because that Easter stuff is a distraction. Why wouldn't the enemy want to set up Easter? Guess what? It means they won't be focused on Passover. If they're not focused on Passover, they're not really looking at the sacrifice of the blood of the lamb. Yeah, they understand resurrection, but they don't really understand it to the fullest because I distracted them with Passover. Like it's. I mean, I'm not with Passover. I distracted them with Easter. So now they can focus on dyeing the eggs instead of removing the yeast that's in their homes. Now they can be focused on doing these hunts instead of hunting out the sin that's in their life and pulling that out of their lives. Now they can be focused on something completely different over here. Meanwhile, they need to be focused on this over here. Like the enemy uses all of these things, y'all, to distract us, and we have to stop falling for the okie doke. This Easter stuff, this Halloween stuff, this Christmas stuff, all these pagan things are distractions. Meanwhile, God actually has real holy days, that are around all of those times of the year that we can be practicing and adopting that are so far better than what we have traditionally known. Halloween is nothing in comparison to the autumn festival. It's the Festival of Tabernacles, I believe. Around the same time as Rosh Hashanah. All of that is sort of back to back. That's so much better than doing something like Halloween. Passover is so much better than Easter. Like that ain't got nothing on it. And so we got to stop letting these distractions happen because it's really taking us out. And I'm telling y'all, if we don't adopt the appointed times that God has and we don't start learning about it and getting into that knowledge, we're not going to be ready. It's a time of preparation for sure. And we're not going to be ready for when Jesus is to return. His second coming. We're going to miss it. Because we're going to be focused on, we're going to be distracted over here. Meanwhile, we're supposed to be over here. You can't be like the tribe of Issachar who discern the signs of the time because you're looking at the wrong time. You over here looking at letting them look at the solar calendar over here, talking about the solar movements of the sun and I forget what the thing is for the solstice. That's what they follow. Looking at the solstices and stuff when you're supposed to be over here looking at the lunar calendar and paying attention to the movement of the stars and what signs and seasons and times it's telling you to do. So we really, 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 really need to reconsider like the real why behind we should be adopting these times. And it's because we don't want to be distracted any longer. We've all been there. We've all done it. But that's because it was traditions that was taught to us. But that same stuff, what they talked about in Hezekiah and King Josiah's time, he said, our ancestors did wrong in the sight of the Lord. And we got to go back and we got to repent for that. We need to move forward with this. And we need to do stuff the right way. bump what our ancestors told us to do. We need to do this the right way. So I'm telling y'all the same thing. Bump what the ancestors told us to do. No, it's not going to get us nowhere. We need to pick up the word of God and read it for ourselves and learn it for ourselves and stop letting the culture and world around us distract us. Ezra said, that's good. We would miss the Passover if it happened again today, waiting the church to teach us prayer, sadly. Yes, absolutely. We would miss it. We're gonna miss it. And I'm telling y'all, we're gonna miss something if we don't get our hearts and minds in order. People are too distracted out here. We gotta get our hearts and minds in order. The Passover meal, verse 21, was eaten by the people of Israel who had returned from exile and by the others in the land who had turned from their corrupt practices to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. Who turned from their corrupt practices. You can't be on both sides of the fence trying to do this. I get that people are learning. You got to make your own decisions for you and your family, but you can't do the corruption. Like how you gonna do the corruption and be talking about the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the same breath? Like it is such a contradiction. I don't even think your brain could allow you to think of both things. It says, then they celebrated the festival of unleavened bread for 7 days, which immediately follows Passover. So Passover is a particular day or evening, whether that very next 7 days is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Within that time frame, there are 2 holy assembly days on the first day and the last day. So what you end up, having is like a full week of a holy day, but it's really a full festival. That's why it's called a festival, because it's like more than one day of feasting. All right. And then there was great joy throughout the land because the Lord had caused the king of Assyria to be favorable to them, so that he helped them to rebuild the temple of God, the God of Israel. So the pattern, y'all, that I have been noticing when we read these different verses is that every time the people were ready to get right with the Lord, one thing that they focused on mainly is getting the house of the Lord right, so that they could celebrate appropriately. And then they use that ability to assemble to then celebrate the feast that God had given. So we got to kind of put that same action order. I mean, they did it every time. We've read 3 stories in 3 nights in a row, and that's what they did like every single time. And so we have to help to get our houses in order in a sense. And that could be your own house this year. You could bring that to the attention of your church. But we got to get our houses in order so that we can celebrate. It's a thing that you got to do. So you cannot be out of order. And so they continue to encourage them to be in order. All right, y'all. That's what I got for you tonight. I appreciate you for tuning in. If it was encouraging to you, save, share, like, follow for more. And by all means, please, please, please consider celebrating Passover on Monday by at least attending a service of some sort and reading for yourself Exodus 12 to better understand the feast. Again, I wholeheartedly believe that if we are not getting in order with what the feast say, what the appointed times say, excuse me, we are not going to be ready for this second coming. We are not going to be ready for this second coming. It's the appointed times that are critical, and you start with Passover because that was the initial one that he gave. Like, other than the Sabbath, I'm sorry, the Sabbath is the real initial holy day that he gave. All the other ones, that he gave, Passover was the first of the festivals. So consider it, pray about it, meditate on it. And I will meet y'all back here tomorrow. I was going to go into the story of Jesus and Passover, but that's not going to be ready. I needed to do another lesson in Passover in the Old Testament tonight. And so we should be ready to get into some New Testament stuff tomorrow and Sunday. So I look forward to seeing you all again, and be blessed.